1942 was a difficult year for the United States in the Second World War. While our military was literally doubling in size, our troops abroad were facing a string of defeats. On May 6, 1942, Corregidor surrendered, marking the end of the Battle of the Philippines and sending nearly 100,000 U.S. and Allied troops into captivity. The home front was desperate for good news when a Universal newsreel touted, "West Point sends her men to war." The newsreel made it seem like this was part of the path to victory, but of the 374 graduates of the United States Military Academy class of 1942, fully 70 would not survive the war. Their names are inscribed on a plaque at the Academy, and their stories deserve to be remembered. I have committed, so far as my meager voice is able, to tell the story of all 70. The Charlotte Observer wrote of a new trend during war at West Point on May 24, 1942. They will lose no time in getting next week's graduates on the way to their eventual stations. The traditional full week of graduation ceremonies has been cut to 3 days, and the young shavetails will have at most a week's furlough between the time they receive their commissions and must report to their service schools. Many of them, therefore, will be married almost before the ink is dry on their commissions, taking advantage of a new War Department dispensation under which they may get married immediately after graduation. In the past, they were forbidden to marry until the day after graduation. 32 graduating cadets were married at West Point over graduation. The Observer writes, "All of these girls realize that the young men that they are marrying will be on active duty and possibly frontline duty very shortly. Many of them must expect to have their husbands shipped overseas within a few short months after the wedding. They, too, are doing their share in upholding the traditions of the service." Among those brides was Miss Betty Rint of Hankinson, North Dakota, who married Keith Grayson Chatfield. You could say that the man the fellow cadets called Chat came from a West Point family. He was the middle of 3 brothers to attend the academy and one of 6 sons of Mrs. Mark Chatfield of Minot, North Dakota, to serve in the Army during the war. Before attending West Point, he'd already served 6 years in the National Guard. Chat went into the infantry, the 407th Infantry Regiment, and he and Betty had 2 daughters, Nancy in 1942 and Joanne in 1944. Initially assigned to the 105th Infantry Division, he was promoted first lieutenant in November and again to captain in June of 1943. He shipped out on September 1st, 1944, in command of Company C of the 102nd Infantry Division's 407th Infantry Regiment. The 102nd saw difficult fighting in the Ruhr area in the fall of 1944, a lesser-remembered battle sometimes called the Battle before the Battle of the Bulge. On November 29th, Captain Chatfield was in the middle of the fight when he went to assist some of his men who had been wounded. His citation for the Silver Star reads, "Captain Chatfield was mortally wounded while attempting to render aid to some of his men who had become casualties. The gallant actions and dedicated devotion to duty demonstrated by Captain Chatfield, without regard for his own life, were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army." Betty Chatfield was informed of his death in combat on December 13th. His daughter Nancy was 2 years old. Joanne was 9 months when their father died. He was 29. Philip Marshall Costain of Moorhead, Minnesota, Cos to his friends, was another one of those cadets to be married at West Point on graduation day to Edith Theodora Smith. Cos also came from a West Point family. His brother Jim was a 1937 graduate, serving with the field artillery. In fact, all 4 Costain brothers, sons of Arthur and Ann Costain, served as officers during the war. Cos had been enrolled at Moorhead State Teachers College, but wanted to get the best education available, and so enlisted in the Minnesota National Guard in order to seek his appointment to West Point. Qualified as a bomber pilot, he deployed to England the week before Thanksgiving, 1943, with the 700th Bomber Squadron of the 455th Bomber Group. The following February, the 700th participated in what was called the Big Week, a series of bombing attacks on German aircraft production facilities intended to cripple Hitler's Luftwaffe before the Allied invasion of Normandy. On February 24th, the 700th attacked a plant that made Messerschmitt Bf-110 aircraft in the industrial city of Gotha. It was a harrowing mission, described as the longest continually running air battle of the Second World War. The men of the 700th endured more than 2.5 hours of flak and fighter attacks. Fighter attacks began in France and continued through to the target and then back again. The 700th was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation for the action. Of 26 bombers of the 700th involved, only 13 returned home. Cos's B-24 was attacked by German fighters early in the battle, knocking out his intercom and killing the waist gunners in the center of the plane. The plane made it through the bombing run, but in the fighting another B-24 was shot down by more German fighters. The stricken bomber then crashed through Cos's plane, tearing off a section of the tail. Only one member of his crew was able to escape. His wife Edith was quoted in the West Point magazine The Assembly. "What I'll never stop feeling angry, bitter, and above all sad about is that Cos couldn't have lived. He was such a good man. He was such an optimist. His presence would have made the world a better place." It wasn't the only sacrifice of the war for the Costain family. His big brother Jim, a lieutenant colonel in the field artillery, was killed on June 15, 1944. When a section of an assault company was cut off from communication, he led a patrol to try to reestablish contact in order to provide artillery support. He was killed while returning fire at an enemy machine gun that had pinned down the patrol. He was awarded a Silver Star for the action. From Paris, Texas, James Madison Caviness, Jr. was the son of an Army colonel. He found the weather in New York to be too cold. The West Point yearbook, called The Howitzer, writes that James's comment for the weather was, "Texas, partner, was never like this." He hoped to go to flight training, but due to a previous injury to his ear was disqualified, and instead went to the field artillery, making him a battery executive of the 83rd Armored Field Artillery Battalion. The unit shipped out in February 1944. A regimental history writes, "On the black night of February 11th, 1944, the 83rd Armored Field Artillery Battalion slid away from the snow-covered dock at New York, New York. This was the first time on the ocean for most of us landlubbers, and the inevitable happened. Just about everyone became seasick, and there was a great demand for space in the ship's latrine and at the railing." The 83rd would fight from D-Day through the Rhine, but Jim Caviness wouldn't be there to see it. Jim was assigned as a liaison to the G2 section of the Corps headquarters. In that position, he was flying in a liaison plane, the little planes called Grasshoppers, while the Corps headquarters moved to a different location in the United Kingdom. On April 12, 1944, the plane took off in bad weather, got 50 feet in the air, and dived. Jim and the pilot were both killed. The young man, who was disqualified from flight school, died in an Army airplane anyway. He was just 23 years old. Back in Texas, where Jim had been an Eagle Scout, Troop Number 13 passed a resolution. "In the passing of Lieutenant Caviness, our armed forces have lost a valuable officer, our town a valuable citizen, and Troop 13 a distinguished member. His death is a distinct loss to this troop, and a personal sorrow to each member of the same." James Edmund Buckley of Troy, New York, was called Tweet Tweet by his fellow cadets, owing to, the editors of the Howitzer say, his inability to speak in a low tone of voice. Gifted with a good singing voice, he never failed to plague us with it while taking a shower. Opting for the Army Air Force, he was promoted to first lieutenant and assigned to the 370th Fighter Squadron on January 27, 1943, and then elevated to the rank of captain on August 29th. He was described as a leader in squadron training, organization, and operations, who was affectionately known by the squadron as Captain Buck. The squadron deployed to England in October 1943. A January 20th, 1944 article in the Troy Record wrote, "He is at present flying a Thunderbolt fighter, escorting bombers as they blast almost daily at Europe. His ship," the paper reports, "has been christened Catherine V, honoring his mother." Unfortunately, by the time that story was published, Captain Buck was already missing in action. Buckley was flying his 9th combat mission on January 11, 1944, one of 20 aircraft of the 370th, escorting bombers attacking industrial targets in northern and western Germany. Buckley was one of 3 pilots who didn't make it back from the mission. 2, Lieutenants Tucker and Hare, crashed near their bases, but Captain Buckley, the leader of A Flight, was last seen in a steep dive at approximately 15,000 feet above the North Sea, several miles from the coast. First Lieutenant C.W. Cunningham attempted to follow the dive, but couldn't. Buckley's plane was not observed to struck the water, but he did not return and was presumed lost at sea. He was posthumously awarded the Air Medal. Austin Patrick Byrne of Woodhaven, New York, was known as Red. The Howitzer said Red is carefree, cheerful, and unruffled, qualities we see all too seldom at West Point. His interests include sports of all kinds, crew racing in particular, and pretty girls. For the latter, he has a definite weakness. That appears to have been the case. After completing his flight training at Roswell, he became engaged to Betty Jane Brigham of Ventura, California, who the Ventura Weekly Post and Democrat described as a gorgeous brunette. They married in New Mexico on Christmas Eve. He shipped out to England the following April to fly B-24s. He was promoted to captain and made operations officer of the 492nd Bomb Group. On August 6, 1944, he was filling in as a command pilot with the 44th Bomb Group, flying a B-24 named Stormy Weather. Despite heavy flak, they made the bomb run safely, but then another plane shifted, possibly hit by flak, and Stormy Weather had to break formation to avoid it. Out of formation, they quickly became a target and were struck 3 times by anti-aircraft fire. The intercom was knocked out and a fire started in the bomb bay. The missing aircrew report said pilots apparently were able to pull out of the spin once or twice, but then it would go back into a dive again. 2 chutes were seen at first, then 8 more. Plane was seen to blow up when it crashed. Of the 12 men aboard, 7 survived. Red Byrne was listed as missing. Excavation in 1946 showed that he died in the crash, perhaps already killed by the flak. Jane told the Ventura County Star that she had received a letter just 3 days earlier. 24-year-old Red Byrne had received the Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, and Purple Heart. Richard Robert Clark of San Diego saw the National Guard as the means to get into the academy. The West Point magazine Assembly explained in 1948, tenacity of purpose marked his military career. Described in the Howitzer as a mainstay of the track team, he has, by his sincerity and ready smile, won a host of friends. The editors of the Howitzer assumed that he would choose the coastal artillery, where he'd served in the National Guard, but instead he chose to fly with his tenacity of purpose, although he found time to marry his sweetheart, Evangeline, shortly after graduation. He deployed to the Mediterranean Theater in January 1944 with the 747th Squadron of the 456th Bombardment Group, flying the consolidated B-24 heavy bomber. By May, he was commander of the squadron when the group went on a mission to Wiener Neustadt, Austria. The mission would earn the group a Distinguished Unit citation. On 10 May 1944, when other groups turned back because of adverse weather, the 456th proceeded to the target and, withstanding repeated attacks by enemy interceptors, bombed the manufacturing center, flying through increasingly severe weather conditions, which broke up the wing formation. As they neared Wiener Neustadt, a break in the clouds opened up and the formation endured wave after wave of enemy attacks. Intense aerial flak, heavy caliber machine gun fire, rocket guns, and cannons led to the loss of 6 aircraft and left the surviving planes riddled with flak. The long bomb run, made into a strong headwind, kept the formation in the flak for 11 minutes. In the grueling attack, 6 planes were lost to heavy flak. Assembly wrote, "He died a soldier's death when he was shot down while piloting a plane on a mission over enemy territory. Comrades who bailed out of the descending heavy bomber said he rode his ship to the ground after ascertaining that all other members of the crew had bailed out safely." Richard Robert Clark was awarded the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Purple Heart, and much commendation and praise from his commanding officer and other airmen of the outfit. After Richard Robert Clark's death, the 747th Squadron's new commander was William Burr Clark, also a 1942 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. The president of his senior class at Baker High School in Oregon, Clark spent a year at West Point Prep School at Fort Scott, California, before gaining appointment to the academy. His goal was clear. His biography in the Howitzer said, "He wants those Air Corps wings." The newspaper The Oregonian reported on the local boy getting his first flight training at Greenville, Mississippi Army Flying School in August of 1942. 2 years later, in October 1944, he was featured again with 3 other young men from Oregon serving in the 547th Bombardment Group. The group had just completed its 100th mission with the 14th Air Force. The men were described as Air Corps veterans. The photo was taken in front of a B-24 named Worry Bird. The Klamath Falls, Oregon Herald and News played on the name, writing, "Worried? The bird on the nose of the Liberator bomber in the background is. These Oregonians in the same squadron aren't." Major Clark had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the nation's highest award for aerial achievement, for his time commanding the 747th. But being a veteran doesn't necessarily protect you in a war. On November 5th, Major William Burr Clark was on board one of 42 B-24s sent to bomb troop concentrations at Mitrovica and Podgorica in Yugoslavia, when the plane he was in, called the Jenny, was struck by flak. It went into a spin and crashed. He was among 9 on board who perished. He was 27. So why 1942? Why not 1941 or 1943? Why the military academy and not the naval academy or the merchant marine academy? Why just Americans and not our allies like the British or the Russians? Well, all those are stories that deserve to be remembered, and I might tell some of them. But the newsreel, juxtaposed with that plaque at the academy listing their dead, seemed to make the class of 1942, who contributed more than their fair share of the some 500 members of the Long Gray Line to have been killed in the Second World War, seem so much more relevant as a symbol of the sacrifice of war, being that they were, as the newsreel says, the cream of America's young manhood. So many stories to tell. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.